Hello, my name is Jo, and on this channel I discuss books, learning languages, sustainability, etc. I have been on a bit of a streak reading fiction that is related to the environment, so I made one of these videos a little bit ago, and then this is the second episode. I don't necessarily plan for this to be as regular as it has been. I've just been on a bit of a bender. So we're going to talk about 5 books today, and we are just going to discuss them in the order that I read them. So first up we have Waste Tide by Chen Tufan, I believe. And this is set in a more technologically advanced future on an island off of the coast of China. This island, which is called Silicon Isle, is basically just... This island is called Silicon Isle, and it is entirely an electronic waste recycling center. The beginning discusses kind of the process of recycling this e-waste, which if you are familiar with electronic waste recycling, or if you've seen my video on the life cycle of an e-reader, you will be aware that for the most part recycling electronic waste is just an incredibly toxic and harmful process. So that is discussed, and from what I can tell, the reality does not differ much from what is presented in this book. After that, the plot progresses and you get into some of the more complex reasons behind this, the politics, the money, the corruption, etc. I don't really know enough about the politics behind it to be 100% sure of the accuracy of that, but also it doesn't need to be fully accurate, it's fiction. I did feel like he did a great job at kind of exposing this issue that not enough people are fully aware of. The plot did, I feel like, kind of fall apart a little bit in the middle, but it still was a book that I felt like was well worth the read. Would definitely recommend it to absolutely everyone. Unfortunately, I did feel like he fell into a lot of the common issues that sci-fi writers often fall into with writing female characters. They all pretty much seemed to exist just to further the plot points of the male characters, but at this point, if you read sci-fi, you're probably used to it. And I did feel like this was worth the read regardless, just because of the importance of the topic. The next book that I read was God's Monsters and the Lucky Peach. This is a novella. It is set in 2267, and there's been a massive ecological disaster, and humanity is one generation into living above ground again. They have the opportunity to go back in time to 2024 BCE to do an ecological study in Mesopotamia. The premise of this book was just so cool, and I felt like the execution was really unlike anything I've read before, and the characters were really interesting. The world building was absolutely astonishing for such a short novella. She would bring up things that you could tell had such a backstory to them and had all this thought that went into it with banks and science and society, but it would just be barely brushed over. So I really found myself wanting much more from this. I saw online that she is writing or planning to write a sequel, so I will definitely read that if it comes out. Ultimately, I didn't feel like this had a lot of substance, so that's why I do really hope that it turns into a series, at least another book, because I felt like there was never really a discussion on what the point of the ecological study was. I just wanted more from it, but at the same time, super creative book. Highly recommend reading it. One small note, she did have an asexual character, which I think is absolutely great, wonderful to represent, but she did equate asexuality with not enjoying sex or not seeking out sex, which is not what asexuality is. That's one possible outcome of asexuality, so I'm not gonna get hung up on the fact that she didn't specifically clarify that that's not true for all asexuals. The next book that I read is my baby and my obsessed author right now, Ursula K. Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest. This is another novella. It is set in the Hainish cycle, which is Ursula K. Le Guin's most prominent sci-fi series. So just for a little bit of context, in this book we have been given a planet to eventually colonize, in the meantime to harvest lumber from. So there is an indigenous population on this planet who are also humans genetically, although there are some differences between the populations of the two planets, as you'd expect after a long time separated genetically. So this is such an amazing book in its discussion of colonialism, of natural resource depletion, of the difference in relationship between people and planet, of indigenous populations and colonizing populations. So much good commentary occurs in here. It definitely packs a punch. If you read reviews online, a lot of people will say that it's too heavy-handed or that it just reads like an angry rant, but it was first written in 1972 and it's just as relevant today as it was then, if not more so. So the fact that in 50 years absolutely nothing has changed, and in hundreds of years before that, I think that justifies being a little bit angry about it. So yeah, highly recommend this book. Everyone should read it. The next book that I read was Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver. This is actually the first Barbara Kingsolver that I have read. She's extremely popular, but I hadn't happened to read one of her books before. This is the story of a young mom living in Tennessee, and she's kind of stuck in a life situation that she doesn't really want to be in, and an act of God occurs in the region, and it kind of covers what unfolds from there. If you are not from the US or you're not familiar with that part of the country, this is set in the Appalachian region, which has recently come into more popular culture with Hillbilly Elegy. There was some controversy about how that represented the region and how that author spoke for the region. I haven't read it or seen the movie, but I am not from Appalachia, but I am from close to there, and I have been there frequently. It is an area with beautiful nature. The Appalachian region has some of the biggest biodiversity on the planet, but it also has struggled economically pretty much forever. So there's a history of lack of education, lack of funding, lack of public resources, and it's an area that's stereotyped a lot. I believe Barbara Kingsolver is from there, and she kind of addresses those stereotypes, especially in regard to climate change, environmentalism, etc., but also just in general. So there were a lot of aspects of this book that I thought were really great. I think that stereotyping rural America is extremely easy to do. It's something that I have done regularly, even being a person who's sort of from there. I still do it, but I think it's really important to remember things that she kind of explores in this book, such as rural people actually have a lot less environmental impact in general. Suburban people have the most. When you're, getting on your high horse about environmentalism, it's important to remember that you are potentially living in a way that's a lot bigger impact than some of these people. But on the other side of the coin, you have people voting certain ways, opposing certain measures from these regions because of a lack of education and a lack of understanding, and quite frankly, brainwashing and indoctrination that happens in these places, and that's kind of covered as well. So I do think it's absolutely essential that we have these discussions and that we talk to people actually from these regions and don't just depend on stereotypes, and I think that this book was great for that. As far as things that I wasn't as crazy about, I did feel like she depended a little bit too much on stereotypes. Just as an anecdote, this is not really a spoiler, but at one point there's a scientist who is confronted by a journalist, and this scientist has been portrayed as a character throughout as an extremely charismatic person. They're a college professor. They, every time they've interacted with another character has been in an extremely natural, educational, just flowing way. But then in the story, as soon as they are confronted by this journalist, they clam up and they're unable to communicate, and they can't make the journalist understand, and they get defensive and just immediately. And it didn't make any sense with the character, and I know the point that she was trying to make. I know she was trying to say that we don't have good communication between the press and science and scientists, but she made that point in such a way that just literally didn't make any sense with the characters that she had. There were just several instances like that where I was like, you were making a point here, but maybe you were making it a little bit too intensely. Additionally, this is a slow book. It doesn't look that big here, but it's 500 pages, and it's extremely character driven, which normally I enjoy, but you just hear just so much from her. Way more than I ever really cared to hear from her. No offense. It was very slow moving. I did end up listening to most of it as an audiobook, and I don't know that I would have made it through otherwise. It was worth the read, but definitely you need to enjoy your slow books to enjoy this one, because I like slow books and this was close to being too slow for me. The last book that I'm going to discuss is Clade, and this was actually a DNF for me. I did not finish this book. It was quite short, so I'm kind of surprised I didn't just push through, but I just didn't have the motivation to. This follows an Australian family through kind of a rapid escalation of climate change. You follow a character in this family or group of acquaintances for a short time, and then the next section jumps forward in time and to a different character. So I never really felt super connected to any of the characters, and also I felt that this was an incredibly privileged take on climate change. It was just not the perspective that I would have told the story from. Maybe that was the point. Maybe he was trying to write something to show that eventually this will even impact rich white people, but it was in effect basically just every time this, a catastrophic event happened, they were basically like, okay, now we gotta go to our other house that we just have in the countryside somewhere. It felt so out of touch and so, it wasn't a perspective that I was interested in reading from. And additionally, there was an autistic character in the book that I just didn't feel like the representation was that great. I am not autistic. I have zero standing to say whether this was good or bad representation. Pretty much everything from other people's perspective was about how his autism affected them, how it made things more difficult for them. I just felt like it was great that he included it, and who knows, maybe he is autistic himself and I have no idea, but I would have rather heard how it was impacting him and how the other people could have supported him better, how they could have made this experience less terrible for him. I did look through Goodreads for quite a long time actually to see if there were any Own Voices reviews, and I didn't find any. I did see one other person who also had an issue with the representation, but yeah, I'm not here to say whether it was good or bad representation, but just something to think about. I don't necessarily recommend this book unless it's jumping out at you as something you want to read. I just didn't really feel like he had anything to say other than you should care about climate change, which you should, but there are books that do that better, I think, like literally any of the rest of these. Definitely my biggest recommendations from this video are these two. They are so good. I highly recommend them. They're very different books, but I think they're both so important, and they talk about the issues in such a nuanced way. So good. So tell me in the comments what you've been reading, and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos. Thank you. Okay, here's hoping that I don't start visibly sweating. In this video, it's like 90 degrees outside, and I had to turn off my fans and close my windows.